So I posed a question on Twitter, and that question that I posed was why in all of the dialogue right now surrounding the crisis that we're facing in the West, it seems like there are very prominent voices from a variety of religious traditions, particularly Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Judaism, and then even some from Buddhism and some other faiths as well. But it seems like Protestantism as a whole is kind of ignored in a lot of these conversations and maybe not really taken seriously, or it's not treated as if there's really anything that Protestantism has to say, or that there's no such thing as classical Protestantism at all. I know that I said something about classical Protestantism in a tweet not too long ago, and Brian Holdsworth, I think is his name, he's a YouTube guy on Roman Catholic, said something like, there's no such thing as classical Protestantism. Like, okay. So the question is, like, why do we not have a seat at the table in a lot of these conversations? Because I think it can get extremely frustrating, and I know that I'm not the only one who feels this way. I know a lot of guys who are involved in, especially Protestant ressourcement, can be rather frustrated that it seems like there is this assumption that if you're a Christian who has anything to say about the decline of the West that we're facing now, morally, ethically, anthropologically, in all sorts of other ways, that basically if you're a Christian, you have to be Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, or that's kind of it. And if you're not, you're probably just some kind of like pop evangelical non-denom type that has really no historical rooting and no intellectual backing at all to what you believe. And I just want to say that is a real misconception of what Protestantism is and what's happening within Protestant intellectual circles. And I think I see a lot of Roman Catholics on Twitter and otherwise saying things like, well, Rome is the only option. Protestantism just leads to modernity, and it's Protestantism's fault that we've fallen into modernity. It's Luther's fault. I critique that whole narrative. I have a whole program on that, critiquing that narrative that's coming out next week. It'll be an hour-long discussion on that question, and I think it's just a total misreading of Luther and a total misreading of the Reformation. But I also I think it's not honest to where Rome is either. I think I would take the claims of Rome a lot more seriously if modernism hadn't crept into the Roman Catholic Church. If you didn't have Pope Francis, if you didn't have, James Martin and his influence and the kinds of clear departures from any kind of classical orthodoxy or classical, anthropology or ethics or all sorts of other things within Rome, if Rome really stood as this strong bulwark against modernity today, and there was actually any attempt at like actual church discipline or dealing with moral or ethical issues in a consistent way from the Roman magisterium, then I could look at that and say, okay, maybe there's something to the argument, right? But it's just not the case. It's just demonstrably not the case. So I think that a lot of the Roman Catholic argumentation really, more than anything else, comes down to this, theoretically Rome does this, and wouldn't it be nice if we had this, kind of infallible tradition that was going to protect the church from modernity, and there's a desire for an authority that does that. I just think that Rome doesn't do it. I think it's demonstrably clear that that's not the case with Rome. I think theoretically it makes for a decent argument, but I need to see proof or evidence on the ground that that's actually happening, and I really don't. So I understand, I think Rome was able to push off modernity for longer than Protestants were, and I think there are some arguments to be made there in favor of certain aspects of Rome there, because I think that's a very valid question to ask. But where we're at today, it's not like Rome is in a much better place. There is institutional unity, but that's really all there is in Rome, is institutional unity. And I don't think there's ideological unity or moral unity or ethical unity within Rome at all. So I don't know that I see Rome as any more unified than Protestantism. It depends on what you mean by unity, I suppose. If you mean unity in one church body, sure. But if you mean unity in the sense of agreed upon doctrine, views of humanity and sin and ethics and sexuality and all sorts of other things, I don't think Rome has it at all. But then it also comes down to the question of what exactly is Protestantism, because when I use that phraseology, this is understandable that people are like, well, why would Protestants have anything to say? Because when I look at Protestantism, I see a million different people with with tons of different perspectives. When I use the term Protestantism, I think what we have to do is distinguish between a classical Protestant theology and the classical Protestant traditions from the various other sects and non-denominational and whatever groups that have arisen since the 16th century. So, personally, I don't use the term Protestantism to refer to your average non-denominational evangelical. I don't use that phrase. I think that the average evangelical in the United States really has hardly any connection at all to classical Protestant theology and what the Protestant Reformation was actually about. And so when I speak about Protestantism, I'm not talking about, your local megachurch. What I'm referring to is the Lutheran tradition, which is what I'm representative of. Obviously, I see the superiority of the Lutheran tradition. You can get that from my channel and everything that I say on here. The Anglican tradition, and then the Reformed tradition. And I think that really when we're speaking about Protestantism, classical Protestantism, what I mean is these traditions. And what I don't mean is a complete distortion of what those traditions stood for by a bunch of progressive denominations that have rejected the authority of Scripture and the authority of the confessions of their church and the historic beliefs of those church bodies. So what I'm talking about is those who are actually consistent with the principles of those who founded those traditions. And when you look at those, what I'm referring to as classical Protestant traditions, many of the things that a lot of Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and those who I have a lot of respect for, dealing with a lot of the cultural issues and I think have great insights, those things are carried onward in those classical Protestant traditions just as strongly. And so what I mean by that is things like natural law, realism, a robust classical philosophical realism. And I would say the rise of nominalism is not some Protestant phenomena. In fact, the Protestant reformers were all pretty explicit in actually rejecting the kind of nominalism that arose in the late medieval period. And once you get to a figure like René Descartes, who's really the most influential philosophical figure for the rise of modernity, he's a Roman Catholic. He's not Protestant. And this kind of direct line that people try to argue that like Luther caused Descartes, caused Hume, caused Foucault, and there's more steps there, I just think is not fair at all. So when it comes to things like the Protestant Reformation, I would say that you certainly see a shift in the 16th century. And a lot of Roman Catholic apologists are going to say this shift is with the Protestant Reformation, and then that leads to modernity. But my contention is that the things that you see showing up in the 16th century when it comes to the rise of nominalism, as well as some of the kind of text criticism that you see within the humanist movements, which I'm not saying that that's bad, but that is going to ultimately lead to a kind of historical criticism. The movements that lead to modernity already exist within the Roman Church in the Middle Ages, in the late medieval period. And I don't think you can draw some line from, Luther causes these things. These things are already in the waters at this point. This is already happening. Like, there's a reason why the Anabaptists and the radical reformers exist at the time of Luther, and it's not because of Luther. There's a reason why these various reformations all happen at this time. There already is a challenging of authority. So you get to, the fact that, for example, the arguments for the papacy that you read in someone like a Thomas Aquinas are largely based on fraudulent documents. That's the reality. So people are going to start to criticize those foundations because they're looking back at these documents and saying, well, is there actual validity to these arguments or not? And there isn't when you look at something like the donation of Constantine. And nobody's going to try to say that the donation of Constantine today is maybe somebody, some SXPX guy or something. But for the most part, people aren't going to argue that the donation of Constantine is a valid document. So those kinds of challenges already exist. What Luther and the Reformation do, I'm talking about the conservative Reformation, the Reformation that preserves the tradition of the church, that very adamantly argues that we are teaching nothing against the Catholic Church, the historic church. They provide a way for people to remain Christian and traditional while also recognizing things like the falsified documents and the things that are happening within the sciences and our broader understanding of the world. And they're saying we don't have to throw out tradition. We don't have to throw out the authority of Holy Scripture in order to accept those things. So I think in some ways, I think the Protestant traditions rising out of the 16th century really help to preserve the tradition of the West in a way that they're saying you don't, just because there are these issues in the church, you don't have to throw out the history of the church. You don't have to throw out the authority of Scripture. We can retain these things, but do so in a way that is historically actually honest when we're looking at things like the claims of the papacy. So when it comes to questions that we have today, then, of we're looking at confusion about gender and the nature of humanity, what human nature is, and ethics, and the culture of death, in all of these various crises that we are seeing in the West. I'm not asking for Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and others to say that Protestants are right, but I think that there needs to be a seat at the table for those who are coming from a classical Protestant perspective. I'm speaking about those who are proponents of philosophical realism, natural law, and adhering to the Protestantism of, say, the 17th century in a modern context, but generally some of those basic philosophical and theological convictions of that era. Because there's a huge, rise in groups. You have groups like the Davenant Institute. You have among Baptists the popularization of Thomas Aquinas and classical philosophy, and obviously my work with Justin Sinner and those who are associated with our organization. But I think that when it comes to these broader cultural issues, we should be coming together on some of these points where we have pretty profound agreement. What I don't think that means is that we can ignore the differences, justification or sola scriptura. I think these are very important differences. I'm very firmly Lutheran. I am convictionally Lutheran. I'm not one to say that we can ignore our differences and who cares. But we need to be able to come together on these issues. And I think when it comes to these battles of you're just a bunch of degenerates or whatever stuff you find on Twitter, like, okay, whatever. You can say that, and yeah, and Lutherans could be just as nasty to Rome too. But when we're coming at these issues with some of the same basic convictions in terms of a basic philosophy and the reality of human nature and the existence and attributes and essence of God and how he relates to his creation, there are profound areas of overlap. So what I'm asking for here is in these conversations that we open up room for classical Protestants. I think there are a lot of insights. Of course I think so, because I think we're right. But there are a lot of insights that can even go beyond our kind of little corners of the church, and insights that can be gained in terms of the broader church and the broader culture as well. So anyway, those are just some of my basic thoughts, and I'd love to hear what you guys think. I'm sure I'll get plenty of the trad Catholics telling me how horrible Protestants are and we're to blame for every atrocity you could possibly imagine, but that's fine. You can leave those comments if you want. Look forward to hearing what you have to say. Make sure you subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. God bless.